Well, it's time now to find out which were the best and the worst performing bourses on the continent last week. And to take us through those numbers, I'm now joined in studio by Thabo Ncalo, Portfolio Manager at Stanlib. Thabo, great to have you in studio with us. Thank you so very much for joining.
Good afternoon,
much
Eleni.
appreciated for your time. So I think
everyone.
let's just touch on Mauritius because it's actually the second worst performing bourse last week. And then we had Mashuda just giving us a little bit of an update there. I mean, with regards to what we've been seeing in the Mauritian market, would you say we've actually seen quite a bit of negativity over the last couple of weeks? Are you expecting this to continue?
Well, I think it's a bit concerning, obviously, with what we're seeing in France today. I mean, we saw, obviously, the equity markets in Europe today have been a bit weak. Obviously, also we saw announcements today that President Sarkozy might not necessarily be doing quite well.
And whether he'll be taking the reins because
exactly,
he's a socialist.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a bit concerning, I think, from a lot of market participants looking at the Eurozone and thinking perhaps, the Eurozone might not be as, as out of the woods as we probably would have anticipated. So, Mauritius, I mean, coming back to Mauritius, Mauritius is a market that's quite linked quite closely to the Eurozone, both from a market perspective, from a political perspective, obviously from a macroeconomic perspective, it's quite important for Europe. So I think, we saw with Mauritius, it was a question, I guess, of a lot of investors looking at the Eurozone thinking, well, maybe we're not out of the woods yet, so maybe Mauritius is also going to continue to get hit. Going forward, I think, fundamentally, I think the Mauritian companies themselves have reported quite good results, and we think they'll be quite strong, and I think the sentiment just perhaps represents a bit more of a dabbling in opportunity especially into the banks.
Foreign activity is quite high. This is obviously very good for the overall market, but again, if we do see more troubles coming through from the Eurozone, we might actually see the outflow of this foreign capital in
last week alone, I mean, foreigners represented about half of the volumes traded on the Mauritian market last year. So clearly, I mean, when you have a bit of foreigners and foreign funds getting spooked by what they're seeing in Europe, perhaps, I mean, you'll know that Mauritian is quite big as well on the sugar side, on the textile side, and most of these products end up in the Eurozone. So, when you're seeing problems in the Eurozone, we're hearing again problems in Spain popping up. Or likely, like some concerns around Spain, I should say. I mean, we think, Mauritius, continues to be beaten up by investors just on the back of what I guess the partners are doing offshore.
So let's touch on Egypt. And year to date, we've actually seen an increase of around 26% on the overall bourse. It was up much higher than that at one point. We've actually seen a bit of weakness. It was down just under 1% last week. Protests still very much underway.
Egypt is a question of politics. I mean, Egypt, we like to look at a little bit like Zimbabwe. Egypt is a question, I guess, of what's going to happen with the constitution, with the transfer of power from the army to the civilian government, or to which civilian government, I guess. Is it going to be sort of a very strong Muslim-driven, sort of Muslim Brotherhood-driven, but perhaps with so much influence by sort of the extremists in the party, or perhaps external extremists? I think that there's a lot of concerns, I guess, around which sort of civilian government we're going to get in Egypt, and perhaps what the policies are going to be. So typically what you're finding, I mean, we saw on Friday in Egypt, we had some more protests obviously around Tahrir Square. We saw a bit more peaceful protests. We actually saw the army, the SCAF, sort of coming up and actually, yielding to some of the demands of the protesters and agreeing to speed up the constitutional drafting program, the processes. We saw the parliament actually yesterday on Sunday, passing new reforms and new terms of how, the political process and the constitutional process is going to go. So I think with that, there was a bit of concern ahead of the protests over the weekend. And that's why we saw the market last week sort of falling by, call it 1%.
But overall confidence, I mean, you've got an IMF loan, which is set to come through with $1.2 billion. So this is going to be very positive for Egypt going forward, at least with regards to growth. Right?
It's the IMF loan that's coming off in May, but there's also a big announcement. The Saudis have also announced that they'll be putting in about $2.7 billion into Egypt in the form of various loans. They were talking even about splitting it, some $500 million that will go into fuel subsidies, for instance, some $750 million that will go into a T-bond, and perhaps around $250 that will go into the development of SMEs in Egypt. So, all these positive flows that are coming in. First of all, I mean, the IMF loan is one that's been in the news and in the media for quite a while. So that's been expected already. As you mentioned, we were expecting 1.2 billion coming out in May. So that's going to be very positive. You will know as well, I guess, obviously with Egypt, that we've been a lot worried around the currency in Egypt. There's been a huge concern for us. And obviously when we get all these flows coming into Egypt, it's quite positive for the currency. I mean, we've seen Egypt sort of deplete all its, quite a large chunk of its resources, of its foreign currency reserves. So all these flows that are coming in, the 2.7 billions, the 1.2 billions are quite positive.
All adding up, absolutely.
They're all adding up, yeah.
Okay, so we've had Egypt under pressure, Mauritius under pressure. No surprise, Zimbabwe is still under pressure. And again, it's the resource sector that's actually driving the overall market much lower.
I guess it's still, every week we still chat about indigenization. I think there's still no resolution around what's going to happen. The primary one we want to see, obviously, indigenization is around what's going to happen with the politics. And I think that's still the outstanding issue in Zimbabwe. We're still seeing a lot of people selling out of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe year to date is down some 8.5%, sort of showing, still that, there's still no catalyst. Particularly, I mean, a large chunk of that pressure in the market is, as you mentioned, coming from the resources stocks.
I mean, even the industrial stocks, we've got Lafarge, which was down around 15-16%, Radar down 42%. But what actually pushed up the industrial sectors, because we've got Bindura, which was up 20%, TN Holdings up 11.5%. So do you think that within the industrial space we're actually seeing a bit more momentum to the upside? Because that's what we're actually looking for,
you
right?
see, the industrial sector, I mean, last week was only down 0.2%, So, I mean, we're finding that, a lot of the pressure is coming from the resources side. So from an industrial side, I mean, also the companies are doing much better. I mean, the consumer names are one we haven't mentioned. The Deltas, the Inscores are doing much better. Obviously, people have to continue eating, have to continue drinking, regardless of what happens. On the cement side, you mentioned some of the names as well that were quite strong. I mean, the other issue, I think, is some of the small caps in Zimbabwe tend to be quite volatile. So they tend to jump up quite a lot. And these represent quite a lot of good opportunities. But perhaps, some volatility, I guess, to be expected.
Okay, so what I'm happy
week,
to announce here is that Nigerian markets were in positive territory last week, and not just slightly, quite a bit. I mean, we saw a gain of around 3.5% in US dollar terms last week. Are we going to see this continuing? And it really has to do with a lot of the banks that have been releasing results of late.
Well, we certainly are hoping it'll continue, because I think the banks in Nigeria have been beaten down for quite a long time. And we seem to think unfairly so for a long time. The Nigerian banking sector represents a lot of value. I mean, just to put it into perspective, we saw the market up in dollar terms, some 3.4% or so, but the banking sector was up almost 10%. It was up 9.8% in terms of the top 10 banks in Nigeria. Most of these banks were up, limit up almost every single day last week, meaning they were up 5% on average, which is the maximum they can trade at. So I think the Nigerian banking sector, we think, will continue. I mean, we're seeing loan book growth in the banking sector for Q1 now coming in excess of 20%. We're seeing NPLs falling to around 5% and below. So I think the story is starting to prove to the rest of the market that, listen, we have solid banks that have been beaten down quite a lot, and I think it is time for the market to come back. And we just as a last point, we can't ignore, obviously, the confidence that was shown to the market by the PIC of South Africa, obviously coming in and taking a stake in EcoBank last week. So I think everyone is looking, saying, well, if the PIC believes in the Nigerian banking sector, why are we not looking,
Okay, so let's touch on Kenya, because we also saw fantastic gains. They're also up around 3.5% in US dollar terms. Mia Sugar is a stock that really sticks out, up 30%. We know that there were a lot of management issues. A new CEO, new financial director has been announced, and this is all the market actually needed to see a fantastic rally.
Mumia's was another good one, I think, and I think in Kenya, I think people are also expecting some moderate rains coming through. So from a sugar perspective, I think Mumia's will continue to do pretty well. As you mentioned, the stock has been drilled down quite a lot. So it represented quite a lot of good value for a lot of fund managers and for a lot of local players in the market. We also naturally saw the banking sector as well coming back quite a bit. The equity banks of this world, the KCBs, I think we expect, and a lot of the players in the market expect some very good growth to come from the banking sector in Q1. So I think that the positive sentiment continues to filter through in Kenya. East African Breweries is another very good one that did quite well. I think there's a lot of buying in Kenya. I think primarily, the Kenyan market was a pretty bad performer last year, I think. And I think most of us are looking back saying, well, you know, the situation won't continue forever. And perhaps, you know, barring over some of the regional sort of risks now that are starting to emerge, like South Sudan and what's happening there. But I think overall, I think people are starting to see, you know, an overall improvement in sort of climate in Kenya, both politically. We're expecting the elections next year to not be as bad as they were. So I think everyone is saying, well, let's look up a little bit. Yeah.
Fantastic, Thabo. We have to leave it there. Thabo Ncalo, Portfolio Manager at Stanlib.